Okay, we're back. Trying to remember where we left off last time. There are tons of extra-canonical Gospels. The majority of these are recognized by scholars as being very late. There's only a very small handful that are even of any interest to scholars who want to discredit the New Testament or make it out like the canonical Gospels are sort of contestants in this big beauty pageant that all of them had to go through. So here's the key question. Actually, let me not jump there yet. Sorry. So how do we get these extra-canonical Gospels? Well, think of them in a sense like fan fiction. You have Lord of the Rings nuts, which I am, and a few other people here are. I know that. It's okay. Love yourself. You have these extra-canonical Gospels being written, particularly in the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th centuries, and they're written for a couple of reasons. One is, again, like fan fiction, they are spinning off of something that is very influential, very positive for the people who are writing them. So it's kind of riffing on something very important, very influential. It's kind of like the reason why there are like 100 million videos of teenage kids playing rock songs on their own guitars, even though they play them really badly and nobody really wants to watch them except for their moms and their friends. So people would write these Gospels not in order to replace the canonical Gospels, but in order to embellish them in some ways, in order sometimes to amend them. So in some cases there's a sense that maybe, in the instance of the Gospel of Mary, for instance, there's a sense that the canonical Gospels are not affirming enough of women. So there's actually kind of this early feminism, whatever you think about that, that devises the Gospel of Mary. But there's not really an attempt to convince the reader, or in many cases there's not an attempt to convince the reader that this is something that comes from just as early, that this is something that's authoritative. Sometimes, though, it is, and this is where it gets a little devious. Sometimes these Gospels are written in order to really wholesale recast what we know about Jesus for different purposes. And so what we're going to see about the Gospel of Thomas, and it's the same way with the Gospel of Judas and a number of other extra-canonical Gospels, and also books of Acts, because there are several of those, that they are trying to promote a Gnostic religious agenda. And Gnosticism, and there are versions of Christianity that are Gnostic, and Judaism also had Gnostic tendencies, or there were Gnostic Jews. What they mean in either case is a sort of religious or philosophical system in which matter is viewed as bad, spirit is viewed as good, God, if he is the creator, must be bad, so Jesus, as the one who shows us the way out of creation, by the way, that's their view of salvation, is to escape the physical world, he must be good, and it often comes with a very complex sort of genealogy of the gods and the spirits. It's crazy, crazy stuff. But in some cases, these extra-canonical Gospels will be written in order to accommodate that philosophical or religious system. Okay, but the key question is this for us, right? Do they provide early, independent portrayals of Jesus? Two parts to that. First of all, early. They have to have been from the mid to late 100s, mid to late 1st century to be of any interest to us, right? Because if it was written in like 150 AD, that's 120 years after the time of Christ. If it's written inside the 1st century, especially if it's like within 20 or 25 or 30 years of the time of Christ, then it may be giving us some information that we really didn't have before, and it's of interest. And it may actually be a challenge to the portrayal of Jesus that we have in the canonical Gospels. Okay? At least that's how the argument goes. So if we find a document that it dates from the same time the Gospel of Mark is being written, at least from a historical perspective, it's as good or better a resource than the other 3 Gospels. So this is a big deal. If we can find that it's early, the other thing is, can we find that it's independent, right? Because if it was written, let's say you have the Gospel of Thomas, let's pretend for a minute that it was written in 85 AD. But if it was just relying on the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it didn't have any of its own independent information on things that Jesus said, and it was just sort of making stuff up off on the side, which is what I would say that it was, it's not that interesting. I mean, it's interesting from a historical perspective because it tells you what certain people believed or wanted to believe about Jesus, but it doesn't actually tell you anything new that you didn't know before about Jesus. It's not a primary source about Jesus. So 2 keys. Has to first of all be early, and the second is it has to be independent resource about Jesus. Note also that similarity of content indicates dependence. Okay, if you have 2 books, and those of you who have been teachers and have had to deal with plagiarism will know all about this. If you have 2 books, and if let's say you have a student's paper and he's writing a paper on Napoleon, to give an example of something that happened to me, he's writing a paper on Napoleon. I wasn't writing the paper, it was a student of mine. He's writing a paper on Napoleon, and you discover an extremely well-worded paragraph in the middle of your ordinarily dim-witted student's paper, and you go and you use the high-tech Google plagiarism detection system, and you just like type in a sentence of his, and you find, lo and behold, that the same paragraph shows up on somebody's website on Napoleon. Then you're going to go to the student and say, hey, guess what? I found the exact same paragraph on the internet, okay? I found it on Wikipedia. What does that indicate? It indicates that the student, well, I guess there are 2 possibilities. One is that Wikipedia actually copied your student, which has never happened to me. The other is that the student copied Wikipedia. So when you have 2 sources, and it's the same way with the Gospels, okay? We do it with Matthew and Mark and Luke the same way. When we see that Matthew and Luke have all of this information that is also already in the Gospel of Mark, then we assume that Matthew and Luke got their information from Mark. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make the information incorrect or less reliable by any means. Also, when we see that Matthew and Luke have the exact same wording, have the same material that Mark doesn't have, we also assume that they're depending on another source, which, of course, as I've said before, we nicknamed Q. So similarity assumes dependence. Let me move on. Either one text is depending on another, okay, or more than one text is depending on an original text. Okay, so let's keep going. Why bother with the extra-canonical Gospels? If they're truly early and independent, they provide a treasure trove of information on Jesus. We know about him at this point almost solely from the canonical Gospels, right? There's a few other mentions in history, like Josephus, the Jewish historian, mentions him, gives him like 2 very glowing sentences, and that's about it. Also, scholars and humans with their attitudes toward Jesus, or scholars are humans and their attitudes toward Jesus, and sometimes make them overeager to accept texts that cast doubt on the understanding of Jesus that we get from the Bible. In other words, people don't want to deal with Jesus as he's portrayed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and the rest of the New Testament, and so they will grasp at texts that give an alternative view of Jesus. If nothing else, they allow us to sort of opt out of really dealing with Jesus, right? Because if we say, well, look, we have all these early texts, there are all sorts of different ideas about Jesus, I guess there's really just no way of knowing about the Jesus of history. And, you know, we're sort of left with a buffet-style Jesus, right? We take the parts we want, we take the parts that fit with our lives and our agendas, and we leave the ones that we don't like behind. And so we can kind of remodel Jesus. He turns into a buffet. And I will be back in a second.